Back when I was attending Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, one of the more popular craft beers that people would bring to parties was Pete's Wicked Ale, which is a strawberry blonde. While this was a time in my life where I preferred to, tap the Rockies, I was never one to turn down a free beer and drank plenty of this stuff, the flavor of which was reminiscent of the strawberry hard candy my grandma used to keep in a bowl on her end table, and that I was never really that big of a fan of. I was much bigger fan of the artificial fruitiness of Blueberry Hubba Bubba. This is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and the focus of this short and shoddy episode is a beer that I made that was loosely inspired by this beloved candy flavor that sadly is apparently no longer available, a beer that I very cleverly referred to as Blueberry Wheat Ale. This was a fun one for me, as I very rarely make beers that are adulterated with fruit or really anything else, but the kind folks at Oregon Fruit Company had reached out and offered to hook me up with some of their puree, so I welcome the opportunity to step outside of my comfort zone. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a little bonus for supporting us, please consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor. Again, if you're interested in helping us to continue bringing you this show and everything else we do at Brülosophy, you can learn more about the rewards we offer for doing so over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to leave those reviews, we'd appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who, in addition to having a rad YouTube channel chock full of great brewing-related content, sell what we believe to be are some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you really do owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120-volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240-volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Timbo from Ohio wrote in with the following question. He says, a professional brewer acquaintance recently went out of business and let me come to the brewery to take some of his leftover base malt. That is rad, Timbo. Good for you. He says, I got a bunch of pale malt and a couple buckets of Munich malt. Now that I'm at the end of my supply, I realized 2 of my buckets had their labels switched, and I just brewed a heavily dry hopped American IPA with 100% Munich malt by accident. I'll obviously not dump it until I try it, but do you have any opinions or experiences as to whether this will be a horrible disaster or simply a malt-forward IPA? Well, first off, that is a classic malt mix-up, Timbo. I've done it. I have a feeling anybody who's been brewing for any amount of time has been there before, whether it's a specialty malt or specialty grain or even the base malt like you. There was one time I made a porter and I completely forgot to even put in roasted grains. So I know what you're going through. Now, the only beers that I've ever made with that much Munich malt are lagers that were hopped with Noble-esque varieties, and I'm not sure I've ever even tasted a hoppy beer made with so much Munich, but I could see this working out fairly well, actually, at least if you enjoy the malt character that's imparted by Munich malt, which I tend to perceive as, like rich malt or toasty, but kind of wet toasty, if that makes sense. Sometimes with a hint of wild cherry. I usually only get that when there's not too much hop character, at least something like, say, a Märzen if you're using a lot of, Munich malt. And it really is just a hint of that wild cherry thing. So, the beer may very well be darker. I'm assuming it is quite a bit darker than what you would expect from using pale malt instead, which some might presume is from crystal malt, and that might, bias their perception when they're drinking your IPA. But I'm confident it's not going to taste the way a beer made with that much crystal malt is going to taste, especially an IPA. So, I would, if I was sharing it with people who are beer nerds and who like to, criticize the beer that they're drinking, I'd probably just let them know, hey, this was an experiment. It's, all Munich malt instead of pale malt. Curious what you think. And that might kind of, tone down their presumption that there's a ton of crystal malt in there. It could end up being really good, maybe not as great as a, paler West Coast IPA, but a tasty sipper in its own right. If the beer's already done, Timbo, please let me know. I'm curious to hear how it turned out. If it turned out way better than you expected, Win, dude. So thanks for the message, Timbo. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Alrighty, don't forget to pick up your very own Brülosophy merch, whether you're looking to warm up with a hoodie, cool down with a tank top, or just look like the beer nerd you know you are. We have got something for everyone. Hell, we're even offering things like throw pillows, tote bags, and tapestries. Prices are quite reasonable, and international shipping is available. We've been seeing quite a few people from around the world picking up our stuff, so it's kind of fun to think of, folks walking around with Brülosophy stuff in countries that are not the United States or Canada. So thanks to everybody who's been doing that. You can check out all of the stuff at brülosophy.com/shop. If you click one of the product images on that page, it'll redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can go straight there, brülosophy.dashery.com. We've also put a link in the description of this episode. Stop guessing and start perfecting your craft with Brewfather, the ultimate tool for recipe design. Brewfather Premium unlocks advanced inventory tracking, tilt integration for real-time fermentation monitoring, and seamless cloud sync across all of your devices. But wait, there's more. Premium Plus just changed the game with Brewfather's brand new AI recipe integration. Whether you're looking to clone a rare commercial classic or need a creative spark for a unique grain bill, Brewfather AI helps you build balanced, world-class recipes in seconds. Brewing is a science. Make it art with Brewfather Premium Plus by visiting brewfather.app today. That's brewfather.app. Better beer is just a click away. My childhood was, it was interesting. I mean, I was born in the early 80s to parents who loved motorcycles, namely Harley Davidsons, really good music, and, other things associated with that lifestyle. I'll let you put the pieces of that puzzle together. As such, my mom was often up really late into the night, and I'm a light sleeper, so I have several foggy memories of walking out of my room at like 3 a.m. into the kitchen, seeing my mom and her friends doing whatever it was they were doing around a mirror on the table, and to coax me back to bed, she would toss me 2 packs of Hubba Bubba bubblegum, a watermelon pack of gum for my twin brother, and a blueberry pack for me. To this day, I can almost taste that pungent artificialness of that blueberry flavor just thinking about it, and I love it. So when Oregon Fruit offered to send me a couple cans of their fruit puree, I opted for one of those cans to be blueberry, and I got really excited to see what I could do with it, thinking that, a nice American wheat beer would make a good canvas. So a little bit of history on American wheat beer. This is one of those styles that really is not very old. In fact, I believe Anchor Brewing claims to have sort of spearheaded the American wheat beer thing with, Anchor Brewing, of course, of California common or steam beer fame. Rest in peace, Anchor. Back in the early 1980s, I think I read somewhere like 1982, 1983, they released a beer called Anchor Summer Wheat, which was followed up a couple years later by what I tend to think of as the quintessential American wheat beer, Widmer Brothers Hefeweizen. Now, I came of age, became legal to drink beer while I was living in Washington State, and Widmer Brothers is based in the Pacific Northwest. This beer was so popular. I think I've told the story before about going out to lunch with some friends at an old spaghetti factory in Linwood, Washington, and I just turned 21, and our friend's boyfriend, who was with us at the time, was a couple years older than me. He strongly recommended that I get this beer. It was served with a wedge of orange, and I'm telling you, it did not bother me. I still enjoy drinking Widmer Brothers Hefeweizen. It's so good. Now, don't get me wrong. Brewers in America were making wheat beers before the 80s. I mean, even pre-Prohibition, but they were modeling them more or less after the Bavarian Weiss beer, which we're all very familiar with. This is that wheat beer that is notably yeast forward, filled with notes of banana and clove. That would be from the isoamyl acetate and the 4-vinyl glycol or 4VG that's created during the fermentation process with specific yeast strains. What Anchor, Widmer, and a few others did was take basically a similar grain bill, maybe up to about half wheat malt or other forms of wheat, using American hops, domestic hops, the ones that were popular at the time. I've seen everything from, cluster to Cascade, really. And perhaps most importantly, though, they were fermenting this beer with a notably clean yeast strain. So, you think about what defines a Bavarian Hefeweizen and that very common banana clovey thing that is part and parcel to that style. You strip all that away, and what are you left with? Well, it's an American wheat beer that is shockingly clean despite looking, like that classic Weiss beer. You get a nice doughy, the malt seems to shine through quite a bit more. Even the hops. This isn't a beer that's highly hopped, but that hop note can kind of come through. The way I like to make my American wheat beer these days, when I'm not adulterating it with fruit at least, is to up that hop amount just a little bit, because the fruitiness from these American hops or even New World hops really does seem to pair well with that nice doughy, bready malt character. So I'm a big fan of the style. The BJCP overall impression says that an American wheat beer is a pale, refreshing, grainy, doughy, or bready wheat beer with a clean fermentation profile and a variable hop character and bitterness. Its lighter body and higher carbonation contribute to its easy drinking nature. Again, a pretty killer style for adding fruit to, which brewers have been doing for as long as beer has been a thing. Of course, the BJCP, being a guide tailored to competition judges, also has a description for fruit beer. And since I did add fruit to my American wheat beer, I felt it only prudent to include that description here as well. Fruit beer is described as a pleasant integration of fruit with beer, but still recognizable as beer. Oh my God, that's such a good point. The fruit character should be evident, but in balance with the beer, not so forward as to suggest an artificial product. Since what I brewed for this short and shoddy was technically a fruit beer, those are the guidelines I'm going to go with for this episode when I'm going through the appearance, aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, and such. So the style description for fruit beer is varies by base style and special ingredients. Each one of these starts that way, so I'm going to leave that part out. So lighter colored beer should show distinctive ingredient colors, including in the head. The color of the fruit in the beer is often lighter than the flesh of the fruit itself and may take on slightly different shades. It's variable clarity, although haze is generally undesirable. Some ingredients may impact head retention. Obviously, that was the appearance. I did make a wheat beer for this, so hazy is perfectly expected. Not a big deal on that one. And also, in my experience, when you've got a hazy beer, the color of that beer is going to look obviously hazy, but it kind of changes the way the beer looks. Things seem to darken up as they get clearer, not darken in a brown and black sort of way, but the richness of a yellow, for example, will get more golden as it clears up in my experience. So in this case, might be a little bit paler looking and hazy. For the aroma, again, based on style, but it says the fruit character should be noticeable in the aroma. However, some fruit, for example, raspberries and cherries, have stronger aromas and are more distinctive than others. For example, blueberries and strawberries. So allow for a range of fruit character and intensities from subtle to aggressive. Hop aroma may be lower than in the base style to better show the fruit character. The fruit should add an extra complexity, but not be so prominent as to unbalance the resulting presentation. Pretty clear. I mean, with American wheat beer, you're looking for kind of a doughy, light white bread, malt aroma. Whatever hops you used, it shouldn't be terribly strong or in your face. This is a more American wheat beer, at least. It's more of a subtle, just real delicate style of beer, at least in my opinion. So it really should serve as more of a canvas for the fruit that you're throwing in there. And that fruit should not overwhelm the American wheat beer, but it should complement it. Moving on to flavor, it says for fruit beer, as with the aroma, distinctive fruit flavors should be noticeable and may range in intensity from subtle to aggressive, but the fruit character should not be so artificial or inappropriately overpowering as to suggest a, quote, fruit juice drink. That's hazy IPA, I think, right? Bitterness, hop, and malt flavors, alcohol content, and fermentation byproducts such as esters should be appropriate for the base style, but be harmonious and balanced with the distinctive fruit flavors present. I like that. I reckon that most of us have probably tried the Lindemans Creek, technically a sour beer, I suppose. To me, that beer is overly cherry forward. I'm not a big fan of it. It's sweet. And they probably intentionally make it sweet, but that cherry character is just so strong. I feel like it covers up any of the beer aspects of it. Now, I haven't had it in years. Maybe they've changed. I doubt it. But when you're making a fruit beer, you still want to taste that underlying beer, in my opinion. So I like balance. I don't want the fruit to be too low. I also don't want it to be overpowering. I want the flavors of all of that to come together to create this kind of gestalt that is satisfying and not overly anything. So as for mouthfeel, the fruit often decreases the body, likely because of fermentation is my guess why they put that in there, because fruit does have fructose. It has sugar that's going to ferment out. So it can make the beer seem lighter on the palate. Some smaller and darker fruits may add a tannic depth, but this astringency should not overwhelm the base beer. Things like black currants, I know people talk about as contributing kind of a tannin character. With blueberries, I know that's a smaller dark berry. I don't get tannins from it. But also the processing that Oregon Fruit Company did to make it into this puree might reduce that anyways. To me, when I opened the can of this Oregon fruit puree, you can tell where, the Hubba Bubba makers got that artificial blueberry flavor from. It really does have a lot of those characteristics. So my hope would be that balances the wheat beer really well. All right. So for vital statistics for American wheat beer, again, I'm not going to go with fruit beer on this one because I was brewing a wheat beer and adding fruit to it. You're looking at 1040 to 1055 original gravity with a finishing gravity anywhere between 1008 and 1013. That will result in a beer that has a, alcohol level ABV of between 4 and 5.5%. The bitterness should not be that high, though there is some flexibility here. The BJCP has a low end of 15 IBU, but it can go all the way up to 30 IBU. That's a fairly noticeable range, in my opinion. An American wheat beer with 15 IBU is gonna be noticeably less bitter than one with 30 IBU. I think I tend to aim for about 22, 23 IBU for what it's worth. I do really like American wheat beer as a style. The SRM, now this does not account for any fruit additions, but your standard SRM for an American wheat beer is anywhere from 3 to 6 SRM. Again, I said this earlier, to me, because of the haze, that is, the normal part of being an American wheat beer, it can look even lighter. So you can make like a 6 SRM American wheat beer, but it might just look a little bit lighter than that compared to a clear version of a 6 SRM beer. So characteristic ingredients and general recipe considerations for, yet again, an American wheat beer. You're looking at anywhere from 30 to 50% wheat malt, and then the rest can be made up of Pilsner, pale, or other low kiln base malts like Vienna malt, stuff like that. I've made a lot of American wheat beer. I've never used any crystal malts in it. I've made a few batches that came out really well that were 50% wheat malt and something. I think I did one that was 50% wheat malt, 40% Vienna malt, and 10% Munich malt, just to try to up that kind of malty richness. And it works really good. Vienna malt to me, does it taste different than pale malt? It does, but not that much different. I know people probably scathing me right now. So I think Vienna works really well in conjunction with that wheat malt. But my typical go-to is just 50% wheat malt, 50% Pilsner malt. That it works every time. Adjuncts, obviously for this fruit beer, it's fruit. I do feel like American wheat beer is just a great style for doing, adulterating it with whatever you want. In fact, my Cocoa Nanilla recipe that I've shared with patrons in the past was based on a wheat beer. Now, that one was based on a Bavarian Weiss beer, but again, all that wheat, there's something about it. You seem to be able to mix a lot of stuff with it, and it just works kind of well. In terms of the hop varieties, you can use American, German, or New World hops. It kind of doesn't matter. I think it really has more to do with what your aim is. I like my American wheat beer to have a fruity edge, even when I'm making it without fruit additions. So I'm tending to reach for, those fruity, citrus forward American hops, or even I've made a few batches with some New World hops from New England, from New Zealand and from Australia. And that works insanely well too. The issue that I have found is that you don't want to overdo the hopping. You can, and there is a I think it's called Oberon, is a wheat beer out there from the Midwest. Bell's Brewery, I believe, makes Oberon. That's kind of a hoppier version of an American wheat beer that is excellent. But for me, the beauty of an American wheat beer on its own is just that balanced malt, hop, and clean fermentation character that just makes it so refreshing. And even though it might not look that refreshing, it really is. And so, like I said, I love Cascade. Cascade's one of my favorite hops for an American wheat beer. I've used Centennial, I've used Mosaic, I've used Simcoe, I have used Galaxy, and I would really like to try one with Nelson Sauvin. I think that sounds like it could be really good. That wheat character would really uphold the kind of winey stuff that you can get from Nelson. Obviously, for the yeast choice, you're going to want to go with something that ferments really clean. I've used the Chico strain from several, labs. That works really good. But my absolute favorite yeast for American wheat beer is the Weihenstephan 3470 strain. For me, that is Imperial Yeast L13 Global. It gets in there, it ferments fast, and it gets out of the way. I'll usually ferment it at between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you're looking at like 17 to 20 degrees C. I'm telling you, if you haven't tried it yet, give it a go. It doesn't make an ester forward beer, but even if it did, you're kind of looking for a little bit of that fruity edge anyways. It is an excellent yeast for American wheat beer in my experience. You could probably use any other clean fermenting yeast as well. I've had plans to do an American wheat beer, but using one of my other favorite ale yeast strains, which is AO9 Pub. That's the Fuller's English strain. Phenomenal yeast for American IPA, phenomenal yeast, obviously, for all those British beers. And I just have a feeling it would work really well in this style too. But you want something that is, it's more clean. It's not known for its yeast character. You want to avoid the Bavarian Weissbier strains, because then you've just got a Weissbier on your hands. All right, the traditional brewing process for this style of beer for American wheat beer, you're looking for, in terms of water chemistry, a soft, balanced mineral profile of around 1-to-1 sulfate to chloride, just to let that hop crispness shine, while also allowing those grainy malt flavors to come through. I've tried various things. I tend to, prefer higher sulfate to chloride in the vast majority of the beers that I make. This is one exception. I do really enjoy the 1-to-1, keeping that sulfate to chloride balanced. And I'll usually aim for anywhere between like 70 and 100 ppm of each, because that's what gets my calcium and such up to where I like to have it. The mash, standard single infusion 60-minute mash. This is a relatively new or modern American style, so it's not like they were step mashing these or anything like that. If you have issues with, stuck mashes or stuck, lautering issues, all that, yeah, you could probably do a mash out or step mash if you need to. I don't think you're going to hurt anything. Probably won't taste any different either. So boil, traditionally, you're looking at 60 to 90 minutes to achieve adequate isomerization of the alpha acids, as well as to drive off DMS. And this is especially important if you are using Pilsner malt. So, that lower kiln Pilsner malt is known for having more of the DMS precursor, SMM, and by boiling it longer, you're going to drive that off. So you need to do that if you're using a lot of Pilsner malt. When you're done boiling that wort, you're going to quickly chill it to ensure a good cold break, and then transfer as little trub to the fermentation vessel as possible. Here's the thing. I've gotten so many comments over the years from people who say, why do you worry about cold break and all of that stuff when you're making hazy styles, whether that's a hazy IPA or a Weiss beer or an American wheat beer? Because the haze is in part a function of other stuff. It's in part a function of the wheat. I mean, yeah, you can leave all that stuff in solution if you want. The one that gets me is the yeast. I don't want to be drinking too much yeast for, gastrointestinal reasons. So these people who are like, who cares, man? It's hazy. No one's going to know. No, I'll know. And people around me will know as well. So anyways, that has nothing to do with the chilling piece of it. I'm going to do my normal practice for every beer that I make is to chill it as quickly as possible with my immersion chiller and then get it over to the fermentation vessel. Depending on the type of yeast you're using, your fermentation temperature can range anywhere from, 50 degrees if you're using a lager yeast up to 68 or 70 degrees if you're using an ale yeast. That's like 10 to 21 C. Pick anywhere in between there with, L13 Global, and you're going to do just fine. The only impact I would say that it's going to have would be on the time it takes to actually fully attenuate. But like I said, that's such a robust yeast. Traditionally, again, I don't know. I've wondered actually how many breweries, if I see an American wheat beer on tap, I always order at least a taster of it because I'm just infatuated with this style. And I've often wondered, like, how many of the breweries that I've gone to that I've tried their American wheat beers have been made with a lager yeast as opposed to an ale yeast. If anybody knows, let me know. I'd be curious to find out. Once fermentation is complete, you can cold crash. I know a lot of people don't because it's a hazy beer, but I still cold crash. I want to get as much of that particulate out of the way before I move on to packaging, so that when I get to packaging, I don't have to wait for it to clear up, then. So I'll cold crash overnight and then proceed with the packaging. Now, do you fine or filter this beer? It's the same thing I was hitting on just a minute ago. I put Whirlflock in every batch of beer that I make. I don't care what the style is. The thing about American wheat beer is that it can, per the BJCP, it can be clear. It can be hazy. So, I don't mind it hazy at all. I love American wheat beer, but if it gets clear, that's not going to bother me either. I like the idea of not having stuff in there that I didn't intend to have in there. And so, yes, I throw Whirlflock in during the boil, and then I will often, cold crash it. Now, do I fine it with gelatin or anything like that? This is one of those styles I will skip gelatin fining on, though I've been curious to test out gelatin fining on. I think this would actually make a really interesting experiment. Gelatin fine an American wheat beer and compare it to one that's not. First off, let's see if the gelatin fine one clears up and the one that's not fine doesn't. But also, if that happens, will you perceive a difference? We have an experiment that we did collaboratively with our friend Ed Coffey from Ales of the Riverwards many, many years ago. And it was on a hazy IPA back when we called them New England IPA. One was fine with gelatin, the other wasn't, and people could not tell them apart. So, my hunch is that it wouldn't have any impact on the flavor qualities, just as all of our gelatin finding experiments have seemed to support. But it would be interesting to see if it actually cleared up, got that protein haze out of the way that you expected in American wheat beer. So again, you don't need to do any of that. This is a style that is okay to be hazy. And even when you're adding fruit to it, that's going to contribute ostensibly even more appearance stuff. So, skip it if you want, filter if you want, doesn't matter. In terms of packaging and carbonation, you are looking for a medium high to high carbonation. This is one of those styles that really needs to have some fizz to it. It almost sounds counterintuitive. I think a lot of people look at these hazier styles like American wheat beer and they think, oh, that's going to be a nice, soft, mellow, maybe even not very refreshing beer, when it's everything opposite of that. It should have a nice fizz that makes you want to come back and drink another pint. Absolutely delicious. And given where this style was invented at the time that it was invented, you absolutely must serve it in a cheap old shaker pint, probably one that has, some print on there from a giveaway of some, you can serve it in whatever style of glass that you want. I like to drink these out of Willie Becher glasses because that's what I like the most in terms of my beer glasses. I love the Becher glasses, and so it works great in this. I also kind of like how the bulge in those glasses really does seem to emphasize that kind of creamy, hazy color of a nice American wheat beer. So that's just my preference, but drink it out of whatever you want. Now, what are we looking for in a good example of an American wheat beer? You want it to be clean fermentation with a doughy, light bread malt character, some hop character. It doesn't have to be in your face. If you're using like noble hops or domestic versions of noble hops, yeah, you might not get much of that hop character up front, but you might get a little bit of spice or earthiness on the finish. Noticeable flavors of whatever fruit it was dosed with should absolutely be there if you are going to add fruit the way that I did in this short and shoddy. That's kind of the trick, right? Is how much do you put in? I've heard anywhere from 1 pound per gallon to up to 3 pounds per gallon of, if you're using strawberries, I think you need to use 800 pounds per gallon, something like that. I would just do some searching online to see. Now, I used canned fruit puree that was provided to me from Oregon Fruit Company, something that I had zero experience with. So I didn't know exactly how much to use. The can came, it was 3 pounds. So I just went with 3 pounds. We'll talk about that in the next segment. So what are some notable commercial examples? You're looking at Sweetwater Blue, Abita Purple Haze, Sea Dog, Blue Paw, Wild Blueberry Wheat Ale. These are your popular blueberry wheat beers that are out there. I've never had any of these. I've heard of Abita Purple Haze, and the opinions on those seem to be mixed, as it is with most beer styles. But yeah, the only blueberry wheat beer that I'm aware of that I've had is the one that I ended up making myself. And I love blueberry. Little side story. I was down in San Diego many years ago visiting some friends who, the husband of which was a home brewer at the time. He's no longer brewing, but he and I were sitting back having a few of his beers, and we started kind of brainstorming ideas for beer. He really loved using fruit in his beer back then. And so, I told him, like, if I was to use a fruit, I'd probably use blueberries because I just love that flavor of blueberry so much. And it only occurred to me well after I brewed this beer that the initial spark for it, the seed got planted when he and I were talking about it, because he suggested to me that he felt an American wheat beer would be the best style or the best canvas for that blueberry flavor to sit atop. So thanks to Ryan for the idea. I ended up making that. Now, my experience with fruit beers is admittedly quite limited. In fact, most of the ones that I've had are sour beers. I just feel like, broadly speaking, when I think of fruit and beer, my mind kind of goes toward the more tart, acidic sour beers. And by my count, I've only even brewed like 3 batches that I've added fruit to. One of them, it wasn't even fruit. It was like dried orange peel. And I was trying to make my own version of Mac and Jack's African Amber, and it didn't work out that well. It was good. It just didn't taste like Mac and Jack's. So other than that, I think I've added real fruit to one other beer besides this one. And this one was that Short and Shoddy Blueberry Wheat Ale that I served to a bunch of tasters for evaluation. They had no idea how I brewed it. We're going to be getting into those results when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Full disclosure, when I received the Oregon fruit puree in the mail, I experienced a touch of anxiety. Yes, I had agreed to use it, but when it was actually in my hands, I was like, I don't know. I don't really like fruit beer, at least the ones that don't make me pucker, that aren't sour beers. So I ended up setting it on a shelf and ignoring it for a few months. Once I finally felt bad enough that I had this, sponsored product sitting in my garage, I did design this simple short and shoddy recipe. Like I said before, I think the kind of covert inspiration came from my talk with my friend about a decade before I made this beer. Mostly because I felt like, the reason I did the short and shoddy at least was because I felt like spending less time on it would make me feel less bad if it ended up not being good, or if I had to give it all away because I didn't want to drink it. So anyways, this was a full volume 5-gallon or 19-liter batch brewed on a 240-volt electric all-in-one unit. My start time was 7:13 a.m. I started by collecting the full volume of filtered water, and I added an unmeasured amount of gypsum and calcium chloride that I felt would get me close to that balanced mineral profile. I was very familiar with my water at the old house. I'd used it for hundreds of batches. Very, very, almost Pilsen-like soft. I mean, just not very many minerals in it to start with. So I sort of knew what it looked like to add what it looked like, the amount of those salts to add to get to the point that I wanted. So that's what I did. Unmeasured, it sounds like it's all crazy. I kind of knew what I was doing anyways. While the water was heating up, I weighed out and milled the grain. Now, the grain bill. Pretty simple. I talked about it earlier. I went with 50% wheat malt, so the higher end of what the BJCP recommends, and 50% Pilsner malt. In Brewfather, when you're adding things like fruit, it adds it to your grist. So if you look at the recipe on the article, which we've linked in the description of this episode, it's not going to show 50-50 wheat malt and Pilsner. It's going to say, whatever it is plus the fruit stuff. But I'm telling you now that just for the grains, it was 50-50 wheat malt and Pilsner. And that amounted to, for a 5-gallon batch, 5 pounds of wheat malt, 5 pounds of Pilsner malt. Now, when the water was to strike temperature, I incorporated the grains and I set a controller to maintain my mash temperature of 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 C. I went with that temperature because I feel like it's just kind of the ideal middle ground for mashing. You'll notice that I use 152 for a lot of beers that I brew. Part of it also is that I don't like to heat my mash up during the mash rest. So if I go 152, usually even over a full hour, which I did not do for this short and shoddy, usually it'll only drop 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm still within that sacrification temperature range, which I'm perfectly okay with. In this case, though, I left the mash for just 25 minutes, during which I stirred every 5 minutes or so, just to try to coax out as much conversion as I possibly can. That's a little trick that I found when doing these short and shoddy batches or any reduced mash length batch. If you stir it, I don't know why, it does seem to eke out a few more points of OG. At the end of the mash rest, the grains were removed and I proceeded to boil the wort for just 30 minutes. Now, I went with a very unique hop selection for this one. Lupo Max was relatively new at the time. I had some Mosaic Lupo Max in my freezer, and so I reached for that. First off, why did I do Lupo Max? Lupo Max is a concentrated hop pellet. It's got so much lupulin. You don't need to use that much to achieve the bitterness that you would using, T90 pellets. So I thought, well, that works really well for short and shoddy. I can add even less. But Mosaic is also known for having what? A blueberry character to it. So I thought, well, that'll work really well. Overemphasize some of the blueberry notes that come with Mosaic, in addition to the diesel-y stuff and the other menagerie of fruits that people might claim to perceive with Mosaic. So I added 10 grams of Mosaic Lupo Max at the start of the boil. Again, this was a 30-minute boil. So as soon as I started to see bubbling, I threw in 10 grams of Mosaic Lupo Max. Halfway through the boil, at the 15-minute mark, I threw in 7 grams of Mosaic Lupo Max. And then I finished out the boil. When the boil was finished, I very quickly chilled the wort with my Jaded Brewing Hydra immersion chiller. And then I took a refractometer reading showing that it was at 1044 OG. This was before I added the fruit. 1044 OG, not a bad place to start. And also 64% brew house efficiency. I think a part of that had to do with the fact that I did stir the mash so frequently, but man, 64% efficiency. I am not complaining about that. What I found, especially with short and shoddy, and this goes for even when I'm brewing standard, the higher the OG, the more malt that is in my mash tun. It's not huge, but I'll start to see my efficiency come down a little bit. I do full volume mashing no matter what. And I think that also contributes to it. If you're really trying to chase efficiency, you'll probably want to split up, your mash and do a sparge step and all of that stuff. So for me, 64% efficiency is only 6 points less than I get when I'm doing a 60-minute mash. So I was really happy with this. It was at this point, though, that I added the 3-pound can of blueberry Oregon fruit puree to my sanitized fermentation vessel. And then I transferred that 72 degree Fahrenheit or 22 C wort right onto the top of that blueberry puree, swirling it to incorporate it. And, right off the bat, that blueberry puree is like dark purple. And so as I'm racking it in there, I'm thinking, yes, look how purple that is. Well, once it got to that 5-gallon mark, or what was it, 6 gallons in the fermentation vessel, that blue color, that purple color really did, tone down quite a bit. Something I'll talk about more as we move on here. At this point, I took a second refractometer reading that showed the fruit addition added 5 specific gravity points. So for an OG of 1049, which is smack in the middle of what the BJCP recommends for American wheat beer. Totally cool with me. That's exactly what I like. Not too strong, not too weak. Enough for the yeast to get in there and do its thing. I then pitched 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L13 Global. I mentioned it earlier. It's probably my favorite yeast for this style and very quickly becoming my favorite yeast overall, just for being as robust as it is. And, the ability to ferment cool or warm and have it do basically the same thing. It gets in there, it gets to work, and it ferments fairly quickly. So I was pretty stoked to use L13 Global. Why did I pitch 2 pouches though? They were both 8 months old. That's pretty old for yeast. So I was just crossing my fingers and hoping that they weren't totally dead. I didn't do a starter, no vitality, no viability. I just pitched these 2 pouches of 8-month-old yeast right into the wort. And I then connected the wort to my glycol rig. Again, the wort was at about 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 C. When I connected it to the glycol rig, I set the controller to maintain a fermentation temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 20 C. I then checked the clock. It was 9:03 a.m. So the entire brew day from start to just before I cleaned up, you can add another 15 minutes for cleanup if you choose, took me 1 hour and 50 minutes. Under 2 hours for a full 5-gallon batch brew day. That was fruited. I think that's pretty awesome, if you ask me. Now, I didn't notice any fermentation activity for a whole day and a half. So you can imagine, my worry at this point going, damn it, those yeasts, they were probably not good to use, a little bit too long in the tooth. But it did. About 36 hours later, fermentation picked up. It smelled right. It looked right. Everything went swimmingly. And 9 days later, with 0 activity present, I took a hydrometer measurement showing that wort or that beer had fermented all the way down to 1006 FG for an ABV of 5.6%. This is all just lining up. Now, I think that lower FG was almost certainly a function of the fruit. The sugars that were contributed by that blueberry puree were probably 100% fermentable, or the very least 90% fermentable. So, if I hadn't added that, I would guess that maybe this would have finished a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 points higher. But 1006, I'm not complaining. I then cold crashed the beer to 34 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius for 3 days before I proceeded with packaging. Now, real quick, a little side story. A few years before I brewed this beer, when the experiment series was really just taking off at that point, I got an email from somebody suggesting that I disregard all of the cleaning rules associated with brewing. Basically, what they suggested was, and I think they did it as sort of like to snub us, like, if you're just going to test these variables, you might as well not clean your fermentation vessel and not clean your, tubing and not sanitize your this and that. And, I have no desire to see what happens by fermenting in a dirty vessel that's been sitting in my hot garage for 3-4 weeks without being touched. So I did take this opportunity to do something I suspect most listeners will cringe at, though. Rather than transferring the beer to a clean, sanitized, and CO2 purge keg, which is my normal process, I took a keg out of my keezer that had maybe, half to a full gallon of beer left in it. I dumped that beer down the sink. I then immediately replaced the lid and transferred the blueberry wheat beer directly into it. I did do a closed transfer. Again, it's just easier for me given my setup, but I didn't rinse the keg out. I didn't sanitize the keg. I didn't purge it with CO2. So yeah, again, short and shoddy. We're just kind of trying to test the limits and have a little bit of fun with brewing. I then took that filled keg and I placed it on 50 PSI of gas in my keezer, or my kegerator then, for 14 hours, at which point I reduced the gas to serving pressure and I let it sit for another week before I began sharing it with friends. So how did this beer look? I was hoping for that nice purple bluish hue. I've made several batches of this same recipe without using any fruit, and this one was definitely darker than I'm used to. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. If you really looked at it, you might see a little bit of color to it, but I wouldn't say that the blue or purple hues were terribly noticeable. I'm looking at the photo right now, and again, knowing that blueberry was used, it makes the color sort of make sense, but it's hazy beer, so that's good. It looks like an American wheat beer, so that was expected. And the foam, it's mostly white, but maybe a tinge of blue, or maybe that's just my bias from knowing that blueberry was used in it. It was, if you're catching my drift here, it wasn't the blue or purple color that I would hoped for or that I had expected. So, would that carry over in other perceptible aspects? We'll just have to see. My personal impressions before we get to the blind taster results. There really was nothing about this beer that was necessarily off. So score 1 for short and shoddy. It didn't seem that the, reduced mash step, the reduced boil, the racking it to a unclean keg, all of that stuff. It didn't seem that had any impact. It didn't impart any off flavors. It was about as refreshing as the original American wheat beer that it was inspired by. I mean, my standard American wheat beer, it had all of those qualities. However, I personally felt that the blueberry character wasn't as strong as I would have liked. The BJCP mentions a lot about balance and having that nice fruity flavor that is balanced by the malt and maybe some hops. Yet, was it there? I'm pretty sure it was. It was just really subtle to the point that I feel like, I had to work to understand what it was I was tasting. I'm sure there are people out there who understand what I'm talking about. Somebody tells you, hey, here's a beer with this stuff in it. And I'm sipping it going, man, it's almost exhausting trying to figure it out. If you had just given me this beer and didn't tell me what was in it, I probably wouldn't notice it. And that's how I felt about this beer, unfortunately. But what would blind tasters think? This was during COVID, so we were doing some interesting data collection protocol. I did get 14 tasters to taste this one, but it was like masks in my garage, separated by, social distancing and all that stuff. So only 14, not our typical 20. The participants were informed of the style and asked to evaluate the beer based on previous experiences, as well as the BJCP style descriptions of both American wheat beer and fruit beer. I provided those in the survey. So again, there was the American wheat beer, and then right under that, I put the fruit beer description as well. So, these are not people going, and yes, they're blind to the brewing approach that I took, but they're not blind to the style. So one could argue that I am biasing them to perceive blueberry. Not sure what to say about that, but that was part of the process that we did. So in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters rated the strongest characteristic as being its dryness, which yielded an average of about 3.1 out of 5. Malty came in second at 2.4 out of 5, while hoppiness was the lowest rated at 1.1 out of 5. On the surface, all of that makes sense to me. American wheat beer, I expect to be pretty dry. Adding that fruit, at the very least, it helped to dry it out even more. And it seems like tasters perceive that. The malt character, 2.4 out of 5. I think a lot of people, when they hear malt character, they're thinking of that real sweet maltiness. American wheat beer, I would never describe as a malt forward or malty beer. So 2.4 out of 5 actually makes sense to me. And obviously the hop character was rated quite low at 1.1 out of 5. I didn't use that much. I might have, if it was just me, I might have given it a 2 or a 3 out of 5, but there were people who, it seems, rated it maybe even a 0 out of 5 in terms of the hop character. All right. When we break each of those characteristics down and we focus on each one specifically, in terms of hop character, the most prominent hop characteristic that was rated by tasters, 8 out of the 14 tasters, this part is kind of telling, rated berry as being the most prominent hop characteristic. Berry, like blueberries. To me, that's kind of promising because you're like, okay. But then again, they were told that it was made with blueberries, so maybe their minds were kind of making stuff up for them. There's no way to know for sure, but it makes sense to me that would be the case. 3 out of the 14 people said fruity, 2 said floral, 1 said melon. Nobody endorsed earthy, spicy, pine resinous, dank caddy, or onion garlic. So again, this is all kind of lining up with what I would expect. Also, the Mosaic hops are known for imparting some berry character. So if they were, in reality experiencing a berry note, was it from the hops? Was it from the blueberry puree? Was it kind of a function of both of them? Who knows? But the majority did say berry. So I guess that's a win. In terms of malt character, as expected, 7 out of the 14 said cracker bread crust. Another 4 said caramel sweet, which to me, it was furthest thing from sweet, but 2 people said toasty, 1 person said nutty, and thankfully nobody said chocolate or roast. Cracker bread crust, that's what I would say. Really light, doughy. It had all of those characteristics I expect, and I've come to really enjoy in the American wheat beer that I make. So that's where I would have put my rating as well. In terms of yeast character, 6 tasters, again, out of 14, felt it was a clean fermentation character. 3 said esters. I have an opinion on why some people put esters. We describe what each of these is on the survey. Some people, even beer drinkers, may not be familiar with these terms. So for esters, we do put, like fruity, blah, blah, blah. So I could see, even if there was like blueberry in there, some people might think that it was a function of the fermentation or something like that. So 6 clean, 3 esters. 2 people each said phenolics and sulfur. I got neither of those in this beer. So again, other people might be more sensitive to those types of characteristics. One person put wild, so like a wild yeast character. Again, I got nothing of the sort, but to each their own. Now, 4 tasters did feel like they perceived off flavors in this beer, but there was no consistency between them. Each one of those 4 said a different off flavor. One put DMS, another one acetaldehyde, yet another picked grassy, and one thought they detected an estery note. The estery thing, yet again, was, we described it as a fruity note. So if maybe it was the blueberry, maybe it was the hops, but I didn't get any of that in this beer. And I tend to be my own worst critic with beers. This was a very cleanly fermented beer, tasted just like an American wheat beer with something a little different to it. So for my, once we get through all of those questions, we move on to the 2 that I tend to kind of like the most. The first one being how well, based on the descriptions that we provided you from the BJCP, how close was this to hitting the mark? Well, 2 out of the 14 people felt that it nailed it. They rated it a 5 out of 5. I was not one of those people. I don't take this survey. I'm not trying to butter myself up here. I would never have rated this a 5 out of 5 for a fruit beer. For an American wheat beer, I'd probably be close to 4. I really do like this recipe. It's pretty great. But for an American wheat beer with blueberries in it, I just felt like the blueberry note was not pungent enough. Another 4 tasters gave it a 4 out of 5. So there's 6 out of 14 people in the 4 to 5 out of 5 range. 5 people rated it a 3 out of 5. Again, this is in terms of how closely it represents the style per the descriptions that we provided the tasters. 1 person gave it a 2 out of 5. 2 people, and then 2 more people gave it a 1 out of 5. And nobody rated it a 0 out of 5. So yeah, some people didn't think it was a very good, a representation of a fruited American wheat beer. I have to be honest. If I were to rate this, how well it represents the style as a fruit beer, I'm probably in that 1 to 2 range myself, because I would have expected the blueberry to be way stronger than it was. And I already know what I would do to fix it. In terms of how much you like this beer. So this question is independent of how well it represents the style. We just say, regardless of whether you think it's a good example of the style that we were aiming for, did you like drinking it? 4 out of 5 people gave it a 5 out of 5. 3 people rated it a 4 out of 5. So there's your 50% of people are already in that 4 to 5 out of 5 range. 3 people gave it a 3 out of 5. 2 people gave it a 2 out of 5. Another 2 people gave it a 1 out of 5, and nobody rated it a 0. So the vast majority of people at least thought it was drinkable, with 50% thinking that it was actually pretty good. My hunch on this is that what they enjoyed was the American wheat beer, not necessarily the blueberry character, because the blueberry character was so well hidden that it almost felt like you had to fight to know that it was there. I'm assuming some people thought it was, thought they could perceive it, and that's great. I do recall talking with a couple folks afterwards who thought, oh yeah, the subtleness of it actually is what made me like it so much. I'm the opposite. I want that blueberry flavor to be a feature, not just like this subtle thing in the background. So for me, preference, I'm probably going with for the fruit beer, I'm going with like a 2 out of 5. I'll be totally honest. If we were just rating it as an American wheat beer, I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. I love this recipe. If you haven't brewed one in a while, brew one. I think you'll enjoy it. So my overall thoughts, again, not enough blueberry flavor to be obvious, but it was enough to distract from the standard American wheat beer experience, just meaning that without the blueberries, I think it would have been a better American wheat beer. With more blueberries, I think it would have been a better fruit beer, if that makes sense. The 1 pound of fruit puree per gallon would probably work better. So if I had upped the amount of fruit puree in this 5-gallon batch to 5 or 6 pounds, I'm pretty confident that would have made for, or satisfied my desires more. What else I could have done is just made a 3-gallon batch of American wheat beer. I wish so badly that that's what I did, as opposed to sticking with 5 gallons, tailored the volume of the beer batch size to the amount of fruit puree that I had on hand. I don't know why I didn't think to do that back then. I have, minimal regret, but I do regret not doing that. But in the end, since this is a short and shoddy beer, the process did not seem to have any negative impact whatsoever. I don't think that one person who picked up DMS or that one person who got acetaldehyde, I just think they were wrong. I don't think it was there. Rather, the only issue that I could come up with myself was that the fruit wasn't strong enough. So even that dirty keg didn't do anything negative to this beer, which sort of makes sense, right? You had a clean beer in there before. The beer never oxidized. That was probably my biggest concern, is that I didn't pre-purge that keg with CO2. So all in all, I would say that this was a moderate success as an American wheat beer. I had no problems finishing that keg off. Again, this was during COVID, so I drank most of my beer myself, and this keg did not last very long. Really enjoyed it for that. I just wish there was more blueberry character. I was talking with some friends, local homebrewing friends, in a chat when I was analyzing the data for this short and shoddy batch. And they were saying that they've had luck with actual like fruit extracts, especially blueberry, because I made the comment to them that I love artificial blueberry character. Same with watermelon. That artificial watermelon flavor is just so good to me. And they were saying, dude, go get some of these like high-end extracts. You don't need to use that much, and you really do get that kind of hubba bubba blueberry flavor. So that might be in my future as well. But all in all, I was okay with this batch. I was just glad the short and shoddy didn't mess it up. We do have a couple of reader comments I want to get to. The first one comes from Lynn Noella, who says, if you ever considered adding your fruit after fermentation for a more pure fruit flavor. So here's the thing. I do that with ciders regularly. I also have fermented the fruit in ciders. When I make hard cider, my favorite fruit is the mixed berry pack from Costco. It just works really well. It tastes really good. Yeah, I thought about it, Lynn. I mean, that was something that crossed my mind, but I also thought, I want this to be a dry beer. Would the 3 pounds of fruit puree in a 5-gallon batch added after fermentation, would that have made the blueberry stand out more? Maybe. I don't know. I just also don't think that the pungency of blueberry is strong enough. I think it might have needed more anyways. What I wanted to avoid, though, is stabilizing that beer. So if you're going to add fermentables to a fermented beer, it's going to ferment unless you stabilize the beer. And for me, that means using some metabisulfite in conjunction with sorbate, potassium sorbate. I didn't want to add that stuff to my beer just based on the fact that I'd be collecting data on it, and I didn't want to have to warn everybody about it. But it is absolutely something I would consider doing in the future. It works very well when I'm for my hard cider. So I don't see why it wouldn't work really well, for beer too. So final comment comes from Aaron Branshaw, who says, I find that blueberries are one of those fruits that are hard to capture the flavor of during fermentation. At best, you can get a decent blueberry aroma, but the flavor doesn't cross quite as well. I think you need a bit of acidity and or sweetness to complete the picture for the blueberry flavor. A dry wheat beer tends to lack in both. Something like a tart saison or sour will get you closer. I don't disagree, Eric. I do think that there are certain fruits, particularly berries, that the flavor of that fruit is enhanced by lower pH or acidity in general. And that may very well be the case with blueberry. So I appreciate the tip on that. And you actually inspired me. I've been wanting a saison for a while, and a blueberry saison just sounds so good. That saison yeast character with that nice blueberry thing, and then maybe use some lactic acid or I could even kettle sour it just a bit, drop that acidity a hair. That sounds really, really nice. So thank you so much for that tip. That is all the time I've got for this short and shoddy blueberry wheat ale. Don't forget to follow the Brülosophy show over on YouTube, and you can read about this short and shoddy blueberry wheat ale by clicking the link to the article in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.